very much for the presentation. Covered a lot of things. I was wondering, do you see any benefits in providing allograft for patients with multiple myeloma that have adverse cytogenetic characteristics?
It's a very, not an easy issue. The short answer is no, but it's something that is heavily debated. It is a donor transplant for multiple myeloma has been notoriously difficult. The risks are higher than in any other situation. So when I told you the risk of a transplant depend on the health of the patient, depend on the underlying disease, and depend on the donor, using the same matched sibling donor, the same otherwise healthy patient, it is everybody's experience that a patient with multiple myeloma has more risk of dying of complications than an acute leukemia patient. Nobody knows exactly why. I suspect it is because many multiple myeloma patients have kidney damage to begin with from their disease. Myeloma damages the kidneys, but that may not be the only explanation. So it is a very risky procedure for a multiple myeloma patient. That being said, if it's done and if it is successful, the cure rate is higher than with an autologous transplant. It is not 100%, so it's a very risky procedure. So if one really has high-risk features, and one is young and one is otherwise healthy, it's a reasonable thing to do. To give you an idea, we are at the University of Chicago. We are actually, as far as myeloma, we have a limited number of patients for a number of reasons. There's a number of centers in the city, and but we do about 30 transplants for myeloma a year. Of those, 1 or 2 at most are allotransplants. So we are very, very selective about who we offer allotransplant to. I would think most of the large myeloma centers in the United States would give you the same answer.
What are the other secondary cancers for acute myeloid after successful donor?
After a donor transplant?
Yes, donor transplant.
So I think the main risk, patients with graft versus host disease, skin cancers. Then there's a slight increase in other cancers, so screening is more important. Lung cancer, although there's no screening for lung cancer, but there's prevention by not smoking. For women, breast cancer. But skin cancers are probably the main one, particularly in people who stay on cyclosporin or on tacrolimus for a long time.
What about tiredness after a transplant? How long? I had a transplant a year ago, and I still have this heavy tiredness where I suddenly come to the end of what I could usually push through and carry on working. Suddenly I've got to stop. How long does that go on?
Did you have again a donor transplant? Did you have a donor transplant or an autologous yes. transplant? No, there's again, that's fatigue has many reasons, and it's not. I've seen that most people are over that by a year after transplant, but we have seen patients that there can be. It can have to do with some people are still anemic, and I don't know whether you are, but sometimes, sometimes when we do these autologous transplants, in about 10%, 20% of patients, the graft doesn't function as well as it should, and patients are stuck with a low hemoglobin, and that then causes anemia, and that leads to more fatigue. There's other patients who have, for example, thyroid problems, although that's more rare after autologous transplant, but that can cause fatigue. There can be other problems related to having had a disease. People can have heart function problems, people can have kidney problems. All of this can cause fatigue. Lastly, there can be a huge psychological hurdle to overcome, and that's not easy to define. But what I often see in my patients is they've gone through this, they have struggled to get through the transplant, they've put all their energy together to get through this. It's really taken all their energy, and they've done wonderfully well, and done better than any of us would have thought, and coped with it and never complained, and then everything is over, and then we have no energy left, and that can take a lot. It can take a while to get over it. So some of my patients go through somewhat of a depression, even though after everything is over, and some of our patients have benefited from antidepressants, be it for a short period of time. So fatigue these are just a number of the reasons for fatigue that I can think of, but it's a symptom of something rather than a disease by itself, and it's a bit up to you and your physician to figure out what could be the causes. Sir.
When it mentions about avoiding and being careful about dairy products, what products in particular would you say need to be careful of?
Well, I said that mainly dairy products are not dangerous by themselves, but a number of our people, particularly shortly after a transplant, in the first 3 to 6 months, have a functional lactose deficiency and get diarrhea after transplant. So it's mostly in our donor transplant patients, because I mentioned donor transplant, graft versus host disease causes diarrhea, and it can be difficult to figure out.
My daughter had a unrelated donor T-cell ALL, and she's nearly coming up to a year. She's 32. Does her life expectancy change a lot?
Does she have GVH?
Oh, she didn't get it at all.
Yeah, if she's cured of the disease, and it looks like she's cured of the disease, let's hope so. The risk of relapse a year after a transplant becomes quite low. And if she doesn't have GVH, her life expectancy should be quite normal. I have now patients 20 years out, and that's that's basically the answer. Whether her issues of fertility in these young people, it's a big deal. But again, we've occasional thinking of our own patient. I don't remember how old she was when she had a transplant. But she is at least in late 20s, and she had 2 children afterwards. So if she's lucky, she may be able to get children.
Is a secondary transplant an option for any patients if they relapse?
Depends on the disease, depends on the situation, but yes. Short answer again is yes. There's a number of patients with lymphoma that had an autologous transplant that then relapsed, that we have done donor transplants for a second time. There's even some that we have done 2 autologous transplants for. There's occasional leukemia patients that have had 2 donor transplants. It's not always necessary though. So what illness are you talking about?
AML.
AML. So, for AML, if we can, we probably would usually do another transplant if it relapses. And it's been successful.